Normally on this channel, I don't talk about works of science fiction or fantasy directly, but I have bent that rule from time to time when I want to talk about stuff that I think deserves better attention, or that has been an influence on me, or that I think is a useful teaching example. And today, I've got a work of SF that is worth unpacking because it touches on all of those things. It's by science fiction author Harry Harrison, and you might know him as the creator of The Stainless Steel Rat, Bill the Galactic Hero, maybe The Death World Cycle, which is how I discovered him, or Make Room, which was the novel that was the inspiration for the infamous film Soylent Green. But I want to talk today about a work of his that I don't think gets enough discussion. It's a self-contained short story cycle called One Step from Earth, and it's subtitled 9 Science Fiction Adventures in Matter Transmission. And it's got a bit of an old school SF flavor. It's inevitable since it was written in 1970 or so, but there's a lot here that I want to unpack from it. So the central conceit is that these are all stories about the technology of matter transmission, which in the story is abbreviated to MT, like TV as an abbreviation of television. And right at the beginning, Harrison lays out the ground rules for how this technology works. It's not like the Star Trek transporter, where something is beamed from one location to another. There's no copies being made of the thing either. The idea is that you have 2 screens separated by space, which you align to share the space in another dimension. So what goes in one screen comes out the other, and there's no time lag between the two. The idea is that you can put the 2 screens anywhere in space, and you can span that distance instantly. Now, by the way, the digital version of the book, which is the one that's most readily available, it does not have the same preface that I remember being in the print edition. The newer edition, the preface has been cut down a great deal. It omits a lot of the discussion I just summarized. And honestly, I like the longer one better. It's a more interesting read. Plus, the digital edition also includes a story that wasn't in the original collection called In the Beginning, and it kind of seems peripheral to the book's general flavor. You can skip it. The first 2 stories are fairly basic, straightforward man versus nature stories. They're basically science fiction riffs on the same kind of territory that Jack London was exploring in things like To Build a Fire. But there's some SF touches and insights in there. First story deals with the first man transmitted to Mars. So for fans of stuff like The Martian, there are echoes of that kind of survival story. But Harrison has some different things in mind for this tale. I'm not going to ruin what they are. They're worth discovering on your own. Story number 2 involves 3 men landing on the surface of Saturn, underneath all of the liquid gases, where they can set up a matter transmitter to allow access to everything that's down there. And it's essentially a riff on another science fiction staple that you may be familiar with, the cold equations. It involves the 3 men having to make some hard choices to guarantee that at least one of them is going to make it out alive. But the thing is, they're not the choices that you might think. They're complicated by the fact that the matter transmission technology plays significantly into the way things work. And again, no spoilers. Now, after this, the book really begins to open up, and it starts to ask some really intriguing questions with each successive story. Because once we have this amazing technology, there are big questions about what we are going to use it for, aside from the staples of exploration in science. And so the book starts to run through a whole slew of different possibilities. How will it be used to deal with criminals? How will it be used in warfare? How would you handle the consequences of disease outbreaks that are made entirely too easy in the first place because of matter transmission? How would you, if you chose, exploit those who were trapped on planets that did not have matter transmission? How would you use the technology to track a criminal who's using the MT to obscure his path? I like this particular one a lot. This plays almost like a miniature version of thrillers like Day of the Jackal, where you have somebody who's staying one step ahead of the authorities with his cleverness. And then finally, after humanity is gone and some other species has taken over where we left off, but MT remains, and it's a cornerstone of how they do things, and they see what we've left behind very differently than how we might see it. Now, there's 3 basic elements to the way everything works in this book. Number 1 is we set the ground rules. Here's how the system works. Here's how matter transmission works. Here's how it doesn't work. Occasionally these rules are bent, but they're always bent in ways that expand on or comment on the action. They're not cheats. Number 2, we explore the implications, as I've described through each of these stories. But the third and most important thing, which is a part of number 2, is that it tries to connect the implications that are being explored back to people's lives. Everyone in the book lives in a world that has been conditioned in a different way by the presence of matter transmission, in the same way that information technology conditions our modern lives. And it conditions all of our lives differently based on who we are, where we are, how we use this stuff. A big normative thing in a science fiction setting is a standard way to make fantasy or science fiction. It's the big what if, and I've talked about this before. But really the heart of any work of fiction is going to be a what if. It's just that science fiction and fantasy tend to be about these really big normative what ifs. This isn't because the little what ifs are bad or wrong or insufficient. It's only because it's useful to make a distinction between the two to figure out how to make the most of the kind of story you want to tell. Because each of these big what ifs is actually a bunch of other little what ifs, and also some reasonably sized what ifs, and they're all riding around in a trench coat together, so to speak. So if we start with a big what if, like what if we had a device that could transport us anywhere instantly, then we can unpack a whole bunch of other things from it automatically. Like, what if all national borders were effectively rendered meaningless? What if every form of transportation we now have is obsolete? What if real estate and property values didn't matter anymore? What if we had a way to turn any planet into an escape-proof prison? And so on and so forth. And by the way, one of the stories that I covered in my Transcending Influences series, The Star is My Destination, also does the same thing, and with the same basic idea. The idea in that story is you have teleportation as a big normative idea, but it's something that everybody can do. It's a property of human life. It's something we can all tap into. And once people figure out how to tap into that, it upends everything. And so what I liked about that story is how they sit there and they unpack all of the implications of how this would transform society from the inside out. And also how that applies to individual people's lives. So if you have some big normative thing in your setting, some big thing that changes everything, you want to see how many different possible angles you can look at it from. And that's why I like this book. Each of the stories in there is a way of looking at these things from different angles, not only in terms of the implications, but in terms of the people that are touched. So the people in each of these stories, they're not just scientists and explorers, although those figure in as pretty prominent roles. They're also soldiers and assassins and noblemen and doctors and patients and hapless people who get ground up and spit out by the machinery of society, and people stuck doing a job they don't really want to be doing. I also mentioned in my Influence series 2 other works that have a similar normative premise. One of them is Strange Days, and the other is Brainstorm. And they both dealt with the same basic idea. They dealt with the idea of a device that can record and play back sensory input. But I liked Strange Days so much more than Brainstorm, and a big part of why is because Strange Days had a much wider palette of people and situations. Brainstorm was mainly about the lab and the scientists and the government, and Strange Days is about the streets and everybody on those streets. So it's that much wider by default. So everyone in your setting is going to be touched by the implications of the setting. And I mean everyone. So that means there may be opportunities for the kinds of people to include in your stories that you may be missing at first. So you want to look at all the places you've gone in your setting, all the people you've brought in, and ask yourself, where didn't we go? Who didn't we see? And who among the people we didn't bring in might be as good or even better a person to have at the center of the action than the people we already have? So once again, the book in question is Harry Harrison's One Step from Earth. It's available digitally. That's the easiest way to get it. And there are out-of-print paper editions as well. And while you're reading it, as an exercise, think about the way we talked about normative premises, and also think about what you might want to read about in such a setting. You can treat reading the book like an exercise in this respect. You can ask yourself, if I was writing a cycle of stories like this with the same premise, what would I explore? What would I touch on? I know Harry Harrison has touched on a lot of good stuff in here, but you may be able to go further and find things that he didn't. And then think about how those could be applied to your own big normative change. See what you think.